You can be an experienced rider and still struggle. Anxiety, stress, and self-doubt don't disappear just because you've been riding for years. Today's episode is about those quieter battles that often go unseen. So welcome back to Talking Tales. Today's episode is about something that affects riders at every single stage, not just when you're learning, but when you're struggling behind the scenes as well. I'm joined today by Claire Jones, author of Remember You're a Rider, and we talk openly about stress, anxiety, and the mental load that can creep into your riding without anyone else noticing. This conversation isn't aimed at new riders or experts specifically. It's for anyone who's ever questioned themselves, felt pressure to, have I got it together, or found that riding doesn't always feel as easy as it once did, and that does come to all of us at some point in our riding career. So Claire has also asked me to mention, and rightly so, that the foreword to Remember You're a Rider was written by Jim Sanderson from Biker Down, and she wants to say a genuine thank you for his support and for the work he continues to do for us riders. If you've ever struggled quietly while still turning up and riding, this episode will resonate. Let's get into it. Thank you very much, Claire, for joining us. Number one Amazon bestseller, motorcycle reference, got the book. Absolutely love it. I'll be honest, I've got about a third of the way through it and I am engrossed. So I've got a couple of questions for you. A handful of questions, to be honest. And I'm sure we could probably deep dive in some of those as well. So for the listeners then who don't know the book yet and don't know it yourself, how would you best describe Remember You're a Rider, as not as a book, but as an idea within motorcycling?
It's about understanding yourself as a rider, because obviously there's a lot of books out there on motorbikes and training and adventures and, what you might do with your motorbike. But there's very little out there of the experience of riding and learning to ride and who you are as a rider and the process that we go through when we become a rider and how emotionally challenging it can be for some of us. And I include myself in that. Yeah,
likewise myself as well. There's so many things, even if it's like the weather changes, family life changes, other circumstances, and they do have a huge impact. So for those who haven't read the book then, what was happening in your life, in your riding life, that made you realise that you had to kind of create this book and get it out there?
Well, basically, I decided just on a whim when I turned 50, having got, achieved a significant milestone in my life and thinking, what haven't I done yet that I might like to do?
Yep.
Because obviously the clock is ticking and I want to make the most of the rest of my life. And as a coach, as a life coach, my business is called Your One Life, and that is all about making the most of your life. So obviously I wanted to make sure I was doing that for myself as well.
Yeah.
And a real idea popped into my head that of when I rode pillion in my 20s, and then I saw Rebecca Ferguson in Mission Impossible Rogue Nation riding around on a motorbike, and I'm like, that's what I could do. So of course I started talking to all the right people and getting an idea of what was involved, and that I was led to believe that it would be easy and it was fun. And so I started the ball rolling. I booked my introductory ride and my CBT 3 weeks later, so I'd have a bit of a gap in between to, in case I needed any more time to prepare for the CBT. And I even bought a bike. So I bought one at 125 and then turned up for my introductory ride with my leathers and the helmet and everything and feeling all prepared, only to discover I wasn't prepared at all. And what I wasn't prepared for was the shock to my nervous system of getting on that moped, because at this point they were not going to let me anywhere near a geared bike until they'd seen how I could cope on a scooter.
Yep.
So I'm sitting there on this scooter and he's going through everything, and then of course they get to the time where you've got to turn the engine on, and that's when I realised that I was terrified.
Yeah.
And it took me about 18 months to get from that position to actually gaining my full licence and then feeling actually confident in my competence.
Yeah.
So although I had the technical skills, I didn't feel like I was competent with them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I came out the other side of it, and then I was seeing so many people saying the same things that I was about how they were feeling, and and so I started actually. I developed my coaching to expand into supporting riders, whether they were new or not. It was really, the experience of managing nerves and not really understanding why they were feeling the way they were. And then I was realising I was having the same conversations over and over again, and that the need out there was so much greater than what I would be able to do on my own. And not only that, the resources that I was putting out, because I put out a lot of free resources, I'm very passionate that people need to know about this, that it was all fragmented. So like on my blogs and on my website and on YouTube and in Facebook groups and on my Instagram.
Yeah.
I wanted to be able to pull it all together into one place and then be able to just sort of get it out there. And that's exactly what's happened, which is incredibly exciting. And the feedback that I'm getting from riders and instructors is basically saying, this is so needed, and thank you, and spreading the word.
It's not something that's really talked about. And when I did my CBT and my tests, it was not mindset and kind of being within that kind of mental frame of mind to be able to ride a bike was never really discussed at all. One question I've got for you, because you mentioned in the book that your husband doesn't ride. So how did that kind of conversation happen? Because I know you mentioned you took him out for something to eat and said, oh, by the way, I want to ride a motorbike. How did that conversation go down?
Oh, well, honestly, that was again part of the whole kind of experience of managing nerves, because how the hell am I going to tell him? So I've got no idea how he's going to react, because when we met, it wasn't something that had ever been on the radar. It was one of those things that, I'd done before I met him, and it was only a short period of my life. So it wasn't something big that I'd missed or whatever. And so it had never come up in conversation. And knowing when I joined the fire service, how obviously worried about me he was when I was in the fire service, and he coped with it, but he didn't like it.
Yeah.
How's he going to cope with this? So it took me several weeks to actually pluck up the courage. Every time I was thinking about having a conversation, I'd chicken out. No, I can't tell him. So I'm just going to try and get a couple of beers down him before I say anything. And even then, it was like, I've got something to tell you. And of course, he was like, what? And I just couldn't get the words out. I want to, what? I want to learn how to ride a motorbike. Oh, is that it? He said, I thought you were going to tell me you were having an affair. No, he said, oh, it's not that bad. But obviously, because he really doesn't like motorbikes, and he's been very clear about that, but he also knows that he can't stop me and doesn't want to stop me, because he knows that it was something I wanted to do. But he's just said, look, just do everything you can to keep yourself safe. And that was no problem for me, because I, in my former life as a senior manager in the NHS, one of the things I had to manage was risk, and doing risk assessments, and and being in high risk jobs in the prison service and in the fire service. Risk is something that I'm constantly on the alert for. So that was no issue for me. But I think that's also one of the things that made it harder for me when learning to ride, because my nervous system was acutely aware of this risk. This is dangerous, and I don't know how to do it yet.
Yes. I've got a slightly different story, because I've ridden bikes for many, many years. So when I got in my relationship with my wife, obviously I came into the relationship with a motorbike. So, but obviously when we had kids, it was like, are you gonna stop riding the motorbike now? And I'm like, I can't do it. So yeah, I still ride for now anyway.
But again, I'm sure that being aware of that responsibility, or that additional layer of responsibility when you've got kids, is you are then more keen to make sure you're doing all the right things. You've got the right gear, that you're looking after your bike properly, that you're not riding when you you really shouldn't. All of those things, that kind of makes you more aware, I think, of responsibility.
Absolutely. My riding style changed like night and day after we had kids. Before, I was probably a little bit more reckless, a bit younger and a bit naive, taking a few more risks, if you like. Then obviously when we had kids, it was kind of like, actually, I'm going out to go and ride, and I'm going to be calm. I'm going to be calculated in my approach and stay well within my means. So yeah, it's completely changed how I ride. And I think motorcycling is often framed as like a linear journey, more miles, bigger bikes, more confidence. Why does that story break down in real life? Why do you think it breaks down?
Well, I think there's a number of different reasons, and I think it all depends on kind of where in that journey you actually are. So, as a learner, when you're starting right from the beginning, the learning journey on when you learn anything isn't straightforward. There are always going to be times where it feels harder. There's always going to be times that you might make a mistake. And the problem, I think, what makes it kind of harder, I think, for motorcycling is that you're acutely aware of the consequences if you do make a mistake. Therefore, you don't want to make a mistake. But we only learn, or we don't only learn, but we learn a lot from the mistakes that we make. And therefore, it's about looking at what can you control rather than expecting yourself to be perfect all the time. And, if you think, when it comes to perhaps driving, how many times you might drive in a car and have an accident, hopefully is very, very, very tiny, and if not at all. But the amount of times you might see a near miss where something could have happened but didn't, it's how do we take those kind of messages on board, and I think if we're not taking those messages on board, then we might kind of think we're doing really well. Something happens that can knock our confidence, and then we kind of we might be sort of going up and then down and then up again and down, and depending on how much we're beating ourselves up, we might even go, I don't want to do this anymore. Whereas if we can think, well, actually this is a normal part of learning, and as long as the learning is graduated rather than in at the deep end, it gives time for us to build that nervous system safety and that trust in ourselves that we actually do know what to do. And I think that for me was the biggest hurdle, was learning to trust myself and trust my bike. And the two together working in partnership. Yeah,
absolutely. Do you think that newer riders struggle more, or do you think those experienced riders are just better at masking it, if you know what I mean?
I think it's hard to answer that question because everybody's journey is different, and I think different things happen in our lives that can influence how we feel. So, for example, a new learner who's young and never learned it before, their brain isn't necessarily fully developed, so they're not necessarily going to be fully aware of the risks, and they're also relatively recent learners in being at school and things like that. So the concept of learning isn't necessarily so big. And also when we're younger, we tend to pick things up more quickly. But then obviously there's a risk of having confidence before you've got the competence. And that can be obviously a bit of a concern. Whereas I think later in life, we are far more aware of the risks because we're parents, or perhaps we've had experiences in life, whether that's on motorcycles or not, that make us aware of our own mortality. We have stress, we have anxiety, we have things like menopause and perimenopause that really impact on our ability to think cognitively. Our learning spans tend to be shorter because there's less brain space, and I think also it takes longer to learn new things when we're older, and learning is quite a tiring process at the beginning when your brain is having to work really hard to kind of put the foundations in place. Once those foundations are in place, it becomes a little bit less taxing and people can tend to ride for longer. But certainly I had to break my learning up into short chunks because I couldn't cope with doing it a whole day. My brain was just said, nope. And the more that I tried, the more silly mistakes I started making, and I had to stop. And I think when it comes to, different sort of times of life, I think there are different things that have to be taken into consideration. And I say it all comes back to understanding yourself, understanding what your capacity for learning is. And if now is a good time, great. And if actually your life is being squeezed by lots of different things, that maybe taking a break might be a good idea and come back to it when things are calmer rather than trying to push through regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, so obviously when I started reading the book, I originally thought, this is kind of more aimed at like the newer riders, if you like. But actually, the more I read it, I realised that actually it was aimed at a full spectrum of riders. So I lost two friends to motorbike accidents very close together, and it was around the time that my kids were born as well. So I was having extra pressure to say, look, you've just lost two of your closest friends. You need to put the bike away. And I really, really struggled with that kind of sense of identity, because I'd ridden bikes like since I was a kid, motocross bikes, mopeds, and whatnot. And I'd had a few accidents, but nothing too major. But I really, really struggled with that sense of identity, because I'm like, well, in one hand I've got my family, and on one hand I've got friends that I've lost, but then I've got something that gives me so much back in return, that kind of mental clarity. And that bike is a sense of who I am. And I've really, really struggled with that. And we're left with quite a few discussions between me and my wife about it. And to be honest, and I even found myself sometimes going to get on the bike and thinking, no, I feel a bit nervous. I feel a bit anxious. And that's kind of why I like the book, because it kind of talks a little bit about that. And I found, me personally, my way of getting over that was I just took myself to Scotland for a week, and I just rode every single day, and I kind of fell in love with the bike again, if that makes sense, and found that kind of, do you know what? Yeah, there's times when I can take risks, times when I don't, but I don't need to take risks. I can be calm, I can be cool. And I think one thing that's important as well is that, and I've touched on it on a few different podcasts as well, because we're talking to mental health motorbike charity, and we were talking about how it really does help with kind of mental health as well, but making sure that you're only riding when you're not like riding when you're angry. You've not had an argument with someone, you just jump on the bike and that's it, because that's when mistakes happen. Not, there's a good chance of it happening.
Yeah, no, exactly that. And I think I do mention in the book, I can't remember which section off the top of my head, but where I talk about, riders who perhaps, are no longer able to ride, and how that can rock their identity to the core, because they see themselves as a rider, and also this is something that's been a really important part of their lives in terms of keeping their mental health where they want to be. I think it's in chapter 1 or 2 where I talk about flow, and where when you find that position of the experience is just wonderful. You're just in that zone where everything just fits. You're concentrating on what you're doing, and you're present in the moment, and everything just feels really, really good. And if you can't ride anymore, you no longer have access to that experience, and that can be really, I think, challenging for a lot of people. What do they do instead if they can't ride?
Yeah. I always say to my wife, it's like an itch. I get an itch if I haven't ridden for a couple of weeks. I'm like, I'm getting an itch. I need to go out for a ride, because I want that back again. I suppose one of my questions is, when someone starts questioning whether they're still a proper rider, quote, proper rider. I don't think there's a real thing as a proper rider. What's usually sitting underneath that doubt then? What do you think's sitting underneath that doubt?
Quite often it might be imposter syndrome, which is basically when we don't think we belong or we're good enough for something. And I talk quite a lot about that in the book, in terms of that's the same no matter what we're dealing with in life. If we're taking on something new and we don't yet see ourselves as that person who can do that thing, then there's going to be a discord, and it's going to feel very uncomfortable. And the only real way to overcome it is to keep doing it. And start to take the actions as if you were that person. So I want to be this person. I don't feel like I am yet. So it's asking yourself, well, what would that person be doing in this situation? And then start doing that. And it's sort of like in a kind of shadow mode, you end up becoming that person. Yeah. So this, when you first get your gear, you might think, I don't belong in this gear. This looks silly. But the more you wear it, the more familiar it becomes. Yeah. And actually then you go, hey, I love what I'm seeing in the mirror or in the pictures or on the videos or whatever. And that's certainly the case for me. It's like, wow, I really like me as a biker or me as a rider. Yeah. But it took me a while to evolve into that identity, and I think it's the same whatever we do in life. It takes a while to evolve into the person you want to be, but you have to act like that person to become that person.
I think sometimes I don't know if this is more of a trend on blokes, but we don't tend to talk about our struggles as much as maybe women do. But have you noticed a difference in how men and women talk about their riding struggles?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest things that I noticed when I started to create my audience to be able to obviously support was the amount of men who've been coming forward. That was a real surprise to me, because it was the women that I was seeing talking about it on Facebook. Yeah. But once I started to put out my free guide and my Facebook group and my mailing list with my blogs and stuff like that, I think between about a third and a half of the people on my mailing list are men.
That's great.
And I do think that's great, because it's giving them a space to go to get the support that they need, whether they actually, make themselves known to me in a conversation, or whether they just simply quietly lurking, reading, whatever. I don't mind, as long as people know that they can approach me if they want to. But if they're getting what they need from reading my book, or reading my blogs, or just sitting in the background in my Facebook group, or watching along to this, I really don't mind, as long as they know that they're not alone.
Yeah.
And this is very, very common, and it's just that men tend not to talk about it quite so much.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And then obviously you mentioned in the book, and you just mentioned earlier on when we were chatting about menopause, and I don't think it's really discussed in motorcycling. Yeah, it clearly affects confidence and riding. From your experience, what do men in this space most misunderstand about it?
That saying just relax, you'll be fine, doesn't really help. It's about understanding how menopause affects our cognitive functioning and our levels of anxiety, our physical abilities. If you were to Google menopause symptoms, the page will just go on and on and on and on and on. And what quite often happens is there may be women who are riding with no issues whatsoever, and then suddenly they get to menopausal or perimenopausal age, and this anxiety just comes from nowhere, and they don't know what to do with it, and they really struggle. It is getting much more talked about, and there is actually a Facebook group run by one of my friends called Menopause and Motorbikes.
Right.
It is for women only. It's a women-only space, but there is also, quite a lot of resources out there that men can obviously find out about, in terms of how they can support their female rider friends or partners. Yeah. And obviously, I'm more than happy to answer questions about menopause in my Facebook group. So if anyone's wondering about that, I do have some training, because my main sort of coaching area before I started doing this was health and wellbeing, and weight management. And so I am trained in menopausal, information and what have you, and I'm actually doing a more detailed menopause course. So I am, equipped to answer some of the perhaps non-medical questions around menopause and how they can support people.
So is there any advice you would give to blokes like myself that obviously do not experience this whatsoever, but want to kind of assist their wives, their family members? Is there any advice you would give us?
Yeah, I'd say just be patient. Yep. And don't expect consistency, I suppose, from one day to the next, because what's going on in the body is basically a bit of turmoil, and that can really affect mood. So someone who might be quite calm one day might not be the next day, and they might want to ride one day and not want to ride the next day, or they might start feeling like they've lost their confidence. And it's perhaps about taking things back to basics when that happens. So rather than sort of going on a 100-mile ride, maybe let's just go 20 miles down the road on a nice, calm, quiet day where there's not much traffic around, and keep it simple. And that I meant to say earlier actually about the importance of simple rides, rather than, if you haven't been out for a long time and you're anxious, maybe just take yourself on a short ride and have maybe a warm-up lap that you might do, just to kind of get yourself into it before deciding, is it a riding day today or not. If you're sort of not quite sure. I
always think that sometimes I've got a couple of loops in my head that I do locally, but I sometimes have to vary them up, because I sometimes get too, I just assume that the road is going to be okay in front. I don't always, when you're riding a brand new road and you kind of think to yourself, oh, is there a tractor coming out the side of outside of a field here? But when you ride a one same loop all the time, you kind of almost forget about those risks, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and they do say that the most traffic accidents happen close to home because of that reason, because they're the most familiar routes. But the way that I look at it is thinking about, if you're just setting off on a ride and you are feeling a little bit tense, just like you wouldn't go into the gym and lift the heaviest weights first, or you wouldn't go out for a run and start sprinting, you need to allow the time for your brain and your body to warm up into it. So having maybe a warm-up loop that you do and obviously making sure you are paying attention to everything, and that just allows the nerves to settle, because so many people say to me, I don't know what I was so worried about, because as soon as I started riding, I was fine. And it's that anticipatory nerves, and actually just getting going can often dissipate it, but sometimes it can take a few minutes to settle. And I've been out on rides where, I might have thought, well, I was going to go quite far, but actually I'm really not feeling it today, so I'm just going to go home. I've done my warm up and I'm not feeling it. I know this isn't going to be a good ride, so I'm going to go home, and then come out again another day when I'm feeling a bit more into it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what do you think would change then in the motorcycle culture if we talked a bit more about the fear and the hesitation more openly? Because I don't think we do we? We always have that kind of camaraderie of talking about people's chicken strips and bits and pieces, which in all fairness is nonsense. But how do you think
I'd like to see there be more flexibility in the training, and I think some training schools have got it really, really good now, and they're very flexible with how they structure their training, and people could do pay as you go. They can have one-to-ones and all of that, and it's about accepting that there is no one size fits all, and that actually some people need longer to join the dots up at the beginning than others. And the great thing about taking that time at the beginning is that if you do take that time to properly build the foundations, you become a safer rider overall. And by the time it took me 2 months to get my CBT, and that was split over the 2 introductory rides plus 4 short sessions. Yeah. But by the time I was ready for my road ride, or by the time it was due to do my road ride, I was really ready and I felt confident, whereas if I had tried to do it earlier on, I would have really struggled. And it's because I allowed that time, but not just the learning time, but the time in between to consolidate, because our brains do the consolidation when we are asleep, not while we're actually riding. Yeah. So if we are doing a really intensive course, our brain doesn't have the time in between to actually properly consolidate the learning. Whereas if we spread it out more, there's more kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Menopausal brain fog. That's one of the things that happens. So your brain doesn't have quite the time to build the solidity of those foundations. They're a bit more shaky. And it's very true, more time on the seat, more time on the bike is what's needed. But if you are in a fear loop where you keep getting tense and reinforcing the belief that you are not a good rider, more time does not help. It's about breaking those beliefs alongside getting more practice. And that's the work that I see myself doing with, supporting training schools with riders who are perhaps stuck and feeling like they're not making progress, even though they are having the lessons. They're kind of feeling they're not making any progress. And if instructors understand more about the nervous system and what's actually happening inside that rider and why they are stuck in the way they are, then, I would like to see that becomes more well understood, and therefore that learners feel like they are that they are being heard when they're saying I'm struggling here, and that they're not having to meet timescales, because I believe the timescale is the least important part of the process. But unfortunately, the way that things are structured, the timescale is the important part of the process, and actually a lot of people can't meet that timescale, or they can, but they don't feel safe doing so. And that's, if you don't feel safe, it impedes your safety, because your body starts doing the things that make you more unsafe, like stiffening you up so you can't actually turn the bike when you want to. And you end up making silly mistakes because you're overthinking, because you're trying to control every single outcome rather than just actually relaxing into and concentrating on what you're doing. It becomes very difficult to do that when we are when our nervous system is in high alert. So I think if that is better understood both by riders and instructors, I think the training system could be more flexible, I think.
That makes sense. So for riders listening right now then who's questioning themselves quietly, what's the most important thing you'd want them to hear?
Well, firstly, I'd say please read my book, because that will really help you to understand what's going on. But in a nutshell, you're just being the normal human being whose nervous system is on high alert because you're doing something that is fundamentally risky. And in order to be able to ride safely, we have to train our nervous system to feel safe doing something that's fundamentally risky. And therein lies the conflict.
I agree. And then, to be fair, one thing I would add is don't feel pressurized into moving from a 125 to a 600 so quickly. Because for me personally, I'd ridden for many years before moving to a 600 anyway. But that leap from a 125 to a 600 is very, very steep. And I don't think people should be applying any pressure whatsoever onto people to make that leap until they're absolutely comfortable to do so.
And I think it's a very individual decision, because some people do their CVT and DAS in the same week, and then there's others that take much longer, and some people will never get off a 125 because they don't want to. So it really is, I think, like you're right, it's an individual thing, and there should be no pressure. But also, I think it's about getting that balance right, so people don't think that they're not capable of doing it, because with the right training support, with the right instruction, with the right training, with the right support, with the right attitude, I believe it's possible for anyone to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does good support actually look like from other riders, that when they're admitting that they're struggling? What do you think other riders could do to help them? I think we kind of touched on that, didn't we, about not applying too much peer pressure, I think.
Yeah, I think it's about, understanding that if someone's struggling, it's because their nervous system is not feeling safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that the work needs to be done on helping them to feel safe before they can actually start to embed any learning.
So I've done most of my questions, but is there any questions that you feel like I should have asked? Or that anything else you want to kind of pass to listeners that are listening in on the podcast?
Just to reiterate that there's nothing wrong with you if you're feeling nervous,
but
it's about what do you need to do to be able to overcome it. And first of all, it's understanding what's going on and understanding your own unique situation. And the book does have exercises at the end of each chapter that can help you to kind of figure that out for yourself, and then seek the right support. Don't just go to your nearest training school or your cheapest training school. Actually, look at the reviews, have conversations, understand how you like to learn, and find a training school that can help to meet your needs.
Perfect. And where can people find the book?
They can find it on Amazon. And if you just search for Remember You're a Rider, you'll find it, or my name. And you can also get it on my website, which is www.motorcyclemindset.co.uk. There is one other thing I think we haven't touched on, actually, just before we finish, and that is about training after you've passed your test. Because I believe you can never have enough training. It's also obviously not practical to be training every time you go out to ride, and you do need to be able to practice as well. But I think it's about recognising that skills can go rusty, and we can pick up, unhelpful habits that might be hindering us. And I think, it's good to get a refresher every year or so, even if you are feeling confident, because it's about having somebody objective giving you feedback on what you can do and, what you're doing well, but also any areas that you might need to keep an eye on, because at the end of the day, we are really vulnerable out there, and it's very easy to get set in our ways. It's very easy to pick up habits that we might not realise are holding us back. And obviously, who you go to is obviously an individual decision, and there's many out there to choose from. But again, looking at recommendations, having conversations with people before you part with your money, so that you know that you're getting what you need.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, I'm going to be booking my advanced riding course this year. That's something I've been wanting to do for years, and I got kind of nudged into it the back end of last year, so I'm going to be doing that this year, which I'm really looking forward to, because you are right, we're always learning. Every different scenario is it's a learning exercise, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely it is. Yeah.
And so are you working on anything else at the moment?
Well, I'm actually about to start my group program, which is based on the book. So it's for those people who are wanting to implement the book, but perhaps don't feel either confident to do it on their own, or they know that if they left to their own devices, they'll never get around to it.
Yeah.
It's quite often, it's easy to kind of, pick up a book and go, I'll come back to that bit later. I've read the book, but I'll come back to the exercises later, and then not actually do it. So for those who actually really want to get their teeth into it, I'm actually running an 8-week group program, and it's actually starting tomorrow. And I'm basically doing it as a test run with a small group of people to just see how it evolves, and then get their feedback, and then I'll actually then produce it as the final polished version that I will then run later in the year.
Yeah, that's a great idea. That's a great idea. So if listeners remember one thing from either your book or this conversation today, what do you hope it is?
I think it's just there's nothing wrong with you. Absolutely nothing wrong with you if you're finding it hard, and it's all about understanding yourself and then knowing what you need to do next.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Claire, for joining us, and I wish you all the success. And maybe when I finish reading the book, I might come back to you and ask some more detailed questions as well. But thank you very much, Claire.
Delighted. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was Claire, author of Remember You're a Rider. If you haven't got your copy, go and get a copy. It is a good book. If you're someone who rides but is carrying more stress or anxiety than people realise, I hope this conversation has helped you feel a little less alone, because we all do genuinely have moments where riding doesn't feel easy to us. Claire has asked me again to pass on her thanks to Jim Sanderson for the Biker Down for writing the foreword to the book and for the continued support he gives to her and the riding community. I'll put all the links in the descriptions below so you can find the book and you can learn more about Biker Down as well as Remember You're a Rider. Please do subscribe to Talking Tales for more honest conversations about riding, mindset and the parts of motorcycling that don't always get talked about. Thank you very much for listening. Keep it shiny side up, guys.